The carriage had not even stopped moving when the front doors of Ashford Manor swung open, and a tall man stepped out with a face like a closed gate. Grace Whitmore gripped the edge of the seat as the wheels ground to a halt on the gravel drive. She had rehearsed this moment for 3 days, ever since the solicitor's letter arrived telling her she was to be taken in by her distant relations at Ashford Manor. She had imagined polite coldness, awkward silences, perhaps pity dressed up as kindness. She had not imagined a man staring at her carriage as though it carried a disease. The footman opened the door, and Grace stepped down onto the drive, smoothing the front of her worn gray dress. The manor rose behind the man like a mountain of pale stone, its windows catching the late afternoon light. She had never seen anything so large in her life, and for a moment she forgot to be afraid of him and simply stared at the house instead. "You must be Miss Whitmore." The voice cut through her wonder like a blade. She turned to find the man closer now, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes moving over her with open suspicion. "I am," she said, lifting her chin. "And you must be the Duke of Ashford." "Julian Ashford," he said, though he did not offer his hand. "I would say it is a pleasure, but I see no reason to lie to you on your first afternoon here." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had known the Ashfords were not eager to welcome her, but she had not expected the Duke himself to greet her with insult before she had even crossed the threshold. "I did not ask to come here, Your Grace," she said. "My father is dead, and I have nowhere else to go. If my presence troubles you so greatly, I would be glad to hear where else you suggest I might live." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone as quickly as it came. He studied her a moment longer, as though she were a puzzle he intended to solve before supper. "You misunderstand me, Miss Whitmore," he said. "I am not troubled by your poverty. I am troubled by the timing of your arrival, and by how very convenient your father's death has proven for you." The words struck her like cold water. Her father had been ill for months, his lungs weakening with every winter, and his death had been anything but convenient. It had left her alone, friendless, and dependent on the charity of strangers. "You know nothing of my father," she said quietly, "and you know nothing of me. I know that a woman with no fortune of her own has arrived at the door of one of the wealthiest houses in the county 3 weeks after her father's funeral," the Duke said. "You will forgive me if I find that worth watching closely." He turned before she could answer and walked back toward the house, leaving her standing alone on the gravel with her single trunk and her wounded pride. A young footman hurried forward to carry her trunk inside, offering her a small, apologetic smile that told her he, at least, did not share his master's suspicion. Grace followed him up the wide stone steps, past pillars taller than any building she had known, and into a hall so grand it seemed to swallow the sound of her footsteps. Portraits of stern Ashford ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. She felt smaller with every step, and more certain than ever that she did not belong in this house. She was led to a small room on the 3rd floor, far from the family's private quarters, with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the kitchen garden. It was clean and modest, nothing like the grand chambers she imagined lay elsewhere in the house, but it was hers, at least for now, and she was grateful for 4 walls and a door that locked. That evening she was summoned to the drawing room to meet the rest of the household. Lady Beatrice, the Duke's elderly aunt, sat by the fire wrapped in shawls, despite the mild evening, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Grace's plain dress. Beside her stood a younger man, perhaps 30, with a smile too quick and too practiced to be entirely comfortable. "Miss Whitmore," the young man said, stepping forward before anyone else could speak. "I am Edmund Ashford, the Duke's cousin. Allow me to say, you are far lovelier than I expected a poor relation to be." Grace did not know whether to be flattered or offended, and so she said nothing at all, only offering a small curtsy. "Edmund," Lady Beatrice said sharply, "mind your manners." She turned to Grace with an expression that was not quite warm but was, at least, not hostile. "Sit, child. You look as though you have not eaten in days." Grace sat gratefully near the fire, aware of Julian's eyes on her from across the room, where he stood with a glass of wine he did not drink. He said nothing through the whole of supper, watching her with the same cold attention he had shown on the drive, as though waiting for her to slip and reveal some hidden scheme. It was only much later, alone in her small room, that Grace allowed herself to cry. She had lost her father, her home, and any place in the world she could call her own, and now she had arrived somewhere she was told, in no uncertain terms, that she did not belong. She reached for her trunk and opened the small hidden compartment beneath the lining, where she kept the few things she had left of her father. Among his letters, worn soft from handling, was one she had never fully understood. It had arrived only days before his death, sealed and addressed to her in his own unsteady hand, with instructions not to open it until she had reached Ashford Manor. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal at last. My dearest Grace, the letter began. If you are reading this, then you have already arrived at the house of the Ashfords, and I am no longer able to protect you from what I must now tell you. There are things about our family, and about theirs, that I kept from you all your life to keep you safe. You were never meant to grow up poor. You were never meant to depend on anyone's charity. What happened to us was no accident, and what waits for you in that house is not simply a place to sleep and eat until you are old enough to be married off to whoever will have you. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She read the words again, certain she had misunderstood them, but they remained the same, dark and strange in the candlelight. There is a truth buried in the Ashford family that connects to us more closely than you know, her father had written. I could not prove it before I died, but I believe with all my heart that you have a claim to that house greater than anyone there would wish you to know. Trust no one completely, not even those who seem kind. Watch, listen, and when the time comes, do not be afraid to take what is rightfully yours. The letter ended there, unfinished, as though her father had meant to write more and had run out of strength or time. Grace sat frozen on the edge of her narrow bed, the paper trembling in her hands, the Duke's cold words from that afternoon echoing strangely in her mind. You were never meant to be here, he had said, meaning it as an insult, a dismissal, a warning to know her place. But her father's letter said something else entirely. It said she was meant to be here all along, and that someone in this house had spent years making certain she never learned why. Grace folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest, feeling for the first time since her father's death something other than grief. It was smaller than hope and sharper than fear, a feeling she did not yet have a name for, but one she suspected would grow with every day she remained beneath the Ashford roof. Outside her window, the manor grounds stretched dark and silent beneath a rising moon, and somewhere below, in a study she had not yet seen, a single candle still burned, though the rest of the house had long gone to sleep. Grace did not know it yet, but she was not the only one in that house lying awake with secrets, and before the month was out, she would learn that the Duke's cold suspicion of her was nothing compared to the danger waiting inside his own family, hidden behind portraits, ledgers, and smiles that were never quite as kind as they seemed. She had come to Ashford Manor with nothing but grief and a single trunk. She would not leave it the same way she arrived. The next morning came gray and quiet, with a mist clinging to the gardens below her window. Grace rose early, unused to the softness of the bed and the silence of a house so large that her own footsteps seemed to echo. She dressed carefully in her second, less faded dress, determined not to give the Duke any further reason to look at her as though she were something to be swept out with the ash. A young maid named Alice knocked softly and offered to show her down to the breakfast room, chattering nervously about the household as they walked. Alice spoke of Lady Beatrice's fondness for strong tea, of Edmund's habit of sleeping past noon whenever he could manage it, and of the Duke's strict routine, unbroken by weather or mood. He walks the East Gardens every morning before anyone else is awake, Alice said, lowering her voice as though the walls themselves might report her. Rain or sun, it makes no difference to him. My mother says a man who cannot sit still is a man running from something in his own head. Grace filed the words away without quite knowing why they mattered. She found herself watching for the Duke as she ate her breakfast alone, half expecting him to appear and renew his interrogation from the day before. He did not come. Instead, it was Edmund who joined her, dropping into the chair across from her with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere. You survived your first night, then, he said, buttering a piece of bread with exaggerated care. I confess I expected you to have fled by dawn, given how my cousin greeted you. I have nowhere to flee to, Grace said simply. Edmund's smile faltered, just slightly, before returning full force. Well, Ashford Manor could do worse than a bit of fresh company. It has grown terribly dull here, if I am honest. Julian buries himself in ledgers and correspondence, and Aunt Beatrice buries herself in shawls and gossip. You may find yourself the most interesting thing to happen to this house in years. Grace did not know what to make of his easy charm, so different from his cousin's cold reserve, yet something in his gaze lingered a moment too long, assessing her the same way Julian had, only hidden beneath a smile instead of a frown. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, Edmund said, leaning forward slightly. Did your father ever speak of our family, before his passing, I mean? It seems rather remarkable that the solicitor found no other relation willing to take you in, when there are surely cousins on your mother's side as well. The question was asked lightly, almost carelessly, but Grace felt the weight behind it all the same. She thought of the letter hidden beneath the lining of her trunk and kept her voice steady. My father did not speak much of family in his final years, she said. He preferred to look forward rather than back. How wise of him, Edmund said, though something in his tone suggested he did not quite believe her. Later that day, Grace was summoned to Lady Beatrice's sitting room, where the old woman sat with a stack of correspondence and a magnifying glass she used more for intimidation than for reading. "You will serve as my companion while you are here," Lady Beatrice announced, without preamble. "I am old, my eyes are failing, and my nephew has no patience for an old woman's letters. You will read to me, write for me, and in return, you will have a roof and a place at this table. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lady," Grace said, grateful for a purpose beyond simply existing at the edges of the household. "Good." Lady Beatrice studied her for a long moment, the same searching look Grace was beginning to recognize as an Ashford trait. "You have your father's eyes, you know. I met him once, many years ago, before he married your mother and left for the north." Grace's heart quickened. "You knew my father?" "Briefly," Lady Beatrice said, and something shuddered behind her expression, quick and deliberate, the door of a memory closing before Grace could look inside. "It was a very long time ago. Fetch me my letters from the desk, child, and let us not waste the morning on old ghosts." Grace obeyed, though her mind raced. Her father had never once mentioned the Ashfords in all her years growing up. Yet here was a woman who claimed to have known him, however briefly, in a life he had never spoken of. The pieces of her father's warning were beginning to take shape, vague and shadowed, but undeniably real. That evening, walking back to her room after supper, Grace passed the study where she had seen the candle burning the night before. The door stood slightly open, and through the gap she glimpsed Julian bent over a great ledger, his brow furrowed in concentration, a second man standing beside him whom she did not recognize. "The numbers do not match, your grace," the stranger was saying, his voice low and urgent. "Not for the third quarter running. If someone is not careful, this will be noticed." Grace froze in the hallway, straining to hear more, but a floorboard creaked beneath her weight, and Julian's head snapped up. Their eyes met through the gap in the door, and for one long moment, neither of them moved. Then Julian rose and crossed the room himself, pulling the door shut with quiet finality, and Grace was left standing alone in the darkened hallway, her heart pounding, certain now that her father's warning had not been the ramblings of a dying man, but a truth waiting patiently inside these very walls to be found. The candle in the study had been snuffed out quickly, but the image of it stayed burning in Grace's mind long after she reached her room. She lay awake most of the night turning the stranger's words over and over. The numbers do not match, not for the third quarter running. She did not understand ledgers or estates, but she understood fear when she heard it in a man's voice, and the stranger's voice had carried plenty of it. By the time the sun rose, Grace had decided on a plan, small and careful, the kind of plan a woman with nothing to lose could afford to make. She would watch. She would listen. She would learn the shape of this house and the people inside it before she trusted any of them, exactly as her father had instructed. Her days quickly settled into a rhythm. Mornings belonged to Lady Beatrice, who kept Grace busy reading correspondence aloud and writing replies in a careful, looping hand that the old woman approved of after only a little instruction. Afternoons were her own, though she found there was little enough to do with them beyond walking the gardens or sitting with a book she had borrowed from the manor's library, a vast room she had discovered quite by accident on her third day. It was in the library that she first learned to read the house itself, not just its books. The shelves held not only novels and histories but also bound copies of estate records going back generations, kept more out of habit than use. Grace found herself drawn to them despite having no right to look, and no real understanding of what she was searching for. She told herself she was only curious. She knew, in the quiet part of her heart where her father's letter lived, that she was searching for proof. She found her first clue on a rainy afternoon nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, when Lady Beatrice sent her to fetch an old account book from the library shelves, one containing records from 30 years past. Grace located the volume easily enough, but as she pulled it free, a thinner ledger slipped out from behind it and fell open on the floor. She knelt to gather the pages, and a name caught her eye before she could stop herself from reading it. Whitmore, her own name, written in faded ink, beside a sum of money and a date more than 20 years old. Grace sat frozen on the library floor, the rain tapping softly against the tall windows, and read the entry 3 times before she believed it. A payment, made from the Ashford estate to a man named Henry Whitmore, her father's name, dated the same year her parents had married and moved north. Beside it, in different handwriting, someone had written a single word: settled. Settled what, Grace wondered. A debt owed to her father? A debt owed by him? She had no way of knowing, and the ledger offered no further explanation, only the entry itself and the silence of the years since. She heard footsteps in the corridor outside and quickly slid the ledger back into place, tucking it behind the account book exactly as she had found it, her heart hammering as though she had been caught stealing rather than simply reading. When Lady Beatrice's maid appeared in the doorway to ask why she had taken so long, Grace offered a quiet apology about the weight of the books and hurried back upstairs with the volume she had actually been sent to fetch. That night, she copied the entry from memory onto a scrap of paper, determined not to forget a single detail. She did not yet understand what it meant, but she trusted that it mattered, the same way she trusted the fear in the stranger's voice from the study, and the careful way Lady Beatrice's expression had shuddered when she mentioned Grace's father. The following week brought an unexpected shift in the household's rhythm. Julian, who had scarcely spoken to Grace since their first cold exchange, began appearing more often in rooms she occupied, though never quite speaking to her directly. She would look up from her reading in the drawing room to find him standing near the window, watching the gardens, or she would pass him in the corridor and receive nothing more than a curt nod before he continued on his way. It was Edmund who noticed first. "My cousin watches you like a hawk circling a field," he said one afternoon, joining her on the garden bench where she often sat with Lady Beatrice's correspondence. "I begin to wonder if he suspects you of something far more interesting than simple poverty." "I have given him no reason to suspect me of anything," Grace said, though even as she spoke the words, she thought of the ledger entry hidden in her memory, and the letter hidden in her trunk, and wondered if that was entirely true. "Julian suspects everyone of everything," Edmund said, waving a dismissive hand. "It is rather his defining quality. Our father was much the same, God rest him. Suspicion runs thick in Ashford blood, thicker than kindness, I am afraid." Grace studied Edmund carefully as he spoke, noting the easy way he dismissed his cousin even while watching her reaction closely, the same searching quality beneath his charm that she had noticed on her first morning. She was beginning to understand that in this house every kindness came wrapped around a question, and every question came wrapped around a motive she could not yet see. "Tell me something, Mr. Ashford," she said carefully. "Did your family ever do business with mine? Before I was born, I mean." Something flickered across Edmund's face, there and gone so quickly she nearly doubted she had seen it at all. "Business? I could not say. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Grace said, watching him watch her. "Only that Lady Beatrice mentioned knowing my father, briefly, many years ago, and I find myself curious about a past he never spoke of. Aunt Beatrice remembers a great many things that may or may not have happened quite as she recalls them," Edmund said lightly, though his eyes had grown sharper, more alert. "I would not put too much faith in an old woman's memory, Miss Whitmore. It tends to embellish itself with the passing years." He rose then, offering a small bow before excusing himself back toward the house, leaving Grace alone on the bench with the distinct impression that she had touched something tender, without quite understanding what it was. That evening, drawn by curiosity she could no longer resist, Grace found an excuse to pass by the study once more after supper, hoping to find it as it had been on her second night, the door left carelessly ajar. This time, however, the door stood firmly shut, and a low murmur of voices reached her from within, too muffled through the heavy wood to make out clear words. She pressed closer, glancing once down the empty corridor before leaning her ear near the gap beneath the door. "Cannot keep hiding it forever," came a voice she recognized as the steward's, low and strained. "Sooner or later someone will look closely at the accounts, and when they do, no one is looking closely at anything." Julian's voice cut in, cold and controlled, least of all a solicitor's stray relation with nothing to her name. Grace's breath caught at the mention of herself, spoken with such casual dismissal that it stung more than she expected. She leaned closer still, desperate to hear more, when a floorboard betrayed her weight with a sharp, unmistakable creak. The voices inside fell instantly silent. Grace straightened and hurried down the corridor as quietly as she could manage, ducking around the corner just as the study door opened behind her. She pressed herself flat against the wall, heart pounding, and listened to the sound of Julian's footsteps pausing in the corridor, searching, before finally retreating back into the study and closing the door once more. She did not sleep well that night, replaying his words in her mind. A stray relation with nothing to her name. It should not have wounded her, coming from a man who had shown her nothing but suspicion since her arrival, and yet it did, sharper than she wished to admit even to herself. But beneath the sting of his words lay something else, something that mattered far more than her pride. Whatever secret Julian and his steward were guarding so carefully, it was tied to money, to accounts that did not add up, to fear that had followed her since her second night in this house. And somewhere in the family's old ledgers, her own father's name sat waiting, connected to a debt marked settled that no one in this house seemed willing to explain. Grace understood, lying awake in the darkness, that she was no longer simply a poor relation waiting to be tolerated. She had become, whether the Ashfords realized it yet or not, a woman standing at the edge of a secret large enough to shake the foundations of the house itself, and she intended to learn every last piece of it, no matter how carefully it had been buried, or how many cold words the Duke used to warn her away. The days that followed brought a strange new tension to the manor, one Grace could feel humming beneath every polite exchange at the supper table. Julian grew even more watchful of her, though he no longer bothered pretending his attention was accidental. She would catch him studying her across the room, his expression unreadable, and when their eyes met he did not look away as a gentleman ought to, but held her gaze a moment too long before returning to whatever ledger occupied his hands. Lady Beatrice, for her part, grew quieter whenever the subject of the past arose, steering their mornings firmly toward correspondence and away from memory. Grace learned to stop asking direct questions and instead listened for the small, unguarded moments when the old woman's tongue loosened, usually late in the afternoon when her tea had gone cold, and her patience for careful speech had worn thin. It was during one such afternoon that Lady Beatrice let slip a name Grace had not heard before. "Your father was a fine young man once," the old woman murmured, half to herself, staring into the fire rather than at Grace, "before everything with the mine went so terribly wrong. Cedric was never the same after that business, God rest him, and I do not think Henry ever forgave himself, though it was hardly his doing." Grace's pen stilled above the paper. "The mine, my lady, I do not understand. What mine?" Lady Beatrice blinked, as though surfacing from a memory she had not meant to share aloud, and her expression closed as swiftly as a door slamming shut. "Nothing that concerns you, child. An old family matter, long since settled. Fetch my shawl. The fire has grown weak." Grace obeyed, though her mind raced through the fragments she had gathered. Cedric, a name she did not recognize, tied somehow to her father, and to something called the mine, a business that had gone terribly wrong. She thought of the ledger entry she had found, the word settled written beside her father's name, and wondered if it was the very same settlement Lady Beatrice now referred to so carefully. That evening, unable to quiet her thoughts, Grace sought out Alice in the servants' quarters, offering the young maid a few coins she could scarcely spare in exchange for anything she might know of the Ashford family's history. Alice, flattered by the attention and loosened by the coin, spoke freely once she was certain no one else could hear. "There was a mine, once, up in the northern part of the estate," Alice said, glancing toward the door out of habit. "Before my time, mind you, but my mother worked in the kitchens then and remembers it well. There was an accident, a bad one, and men were lost. The old Duke, that would be the current Duke's father, closed the mine after that and never spoke of it again. Some say he paid a great deal of money to keep the matter quiet, to families of the men who died, and to others besides." "Others besides?" Grace pressed gently. Alice hesitated, twisting her apron between her fingers. "There was a partner, my mother said, a man who had put his own money into the mine alongside the Ashfords, and who lost nearly everything when it closed. I do not know his name, miss, truly I do not, but my mother always said it was a scandal the family worked hard to bury, and buried well, seeing as no one speaks of it now." Grace thanked Alice and returned to her room with her thoughts spinning faster than before. A mine, an accident, a partner who had lost everything, a settlement marked in careful ink beside her father's name. The pieces were beginning to form a shape, faint and uncertain, but unmistakably real, and every new fragment made her more certain that her father's warning had been no dying man's confusion, but a truth he had carried in silence for her entire life. She pressed her hand against the hidden compartment in her trunk where his letter still lay, and made herself a quiet promise in the darkness of her small room. Whatever the Ashfords had buried in that northern mine, whatever debt had been settled with her father's name attached to it, she would uncover it fully, no matter how carefully Julian, or Edmund, or even kind, sharp-eyed Lady Beatrice tried to keep it hidden from her. She had come to this house believing herself unwanted. She was beginning to suspect she had been feared instead, and the difference between those two things, she was learning quickly, could change everything. The library door had been left unlocked, which was the only reason Grace found herself standing before the tall shelf of estate ledgers again, 3 weeks after her first discovery, with a single candle, and a growing determination to understand what the word settled truly meant. She had waited until the house had gone quiet, until Lady Beatrice's snoring could be heard faintly through her chamber door, and Edmund's laughter had long since faded from the drawing room below. She told herself she was simply reading, that any woman with an idle evening and access to a library might wish to pass the hours among old books. She did not entirely believe her own excuse, and she suspected, deep down, that she did not need to. The thin ledger was exactly where she remembered it, tucked behind the heavier account book from 30 years past. This time, she carried it to the small reading table near the window and opened it fully, running her finger down each entry with painstaking care, searching for anything else that might connect to the mine Alice had spoken of, or to the name Cedric that Lady Beatrice had let slip so carelessly. She found more than she expected. Several pages after the entry bearing her father's name, another entry caught her eye, this one referencing a mining venture in the northern parcels of the estate, dated the same year, with a sum of money so large it made Grace's breath catch in her throat. Beside it, in the same careful hand, someone had written a brief and chilling note. Investment lost, Ashford share protected, Whitmore share forfeited. Forfeited, not settled, as she had first believed, but forfeited, taken, lost entirely. Grace read the words again and again, trying to understand what they meant for her father, for the man who had raised her in quiet poverty in a small northern town, never once speaking of wealth or title or any connection to a family as grand as the Ashfords. She turned the page, hands trembling now, and found a final entry that stole what remained of her composure. A death recorded, dated only weeks after the forfeiture, the name beside it unfamiliar to her, Cedric Whitmore. Beneath it, in smaller writing, a note that made her blood run cold. Elder brother of Henry Whitmore. Accident in the northern shaft. No claim pursued. Grace sat frozen at the table, the candle guttering beside her, as the shape of her father's warning finally became clear. Cedric Whitmore, her father's brother. An uncle she had never known existed, dead in a mining accident on Ashford land, his death recorded with cold, careless brevity, no claim pursued, as though a man's life could be settled with 3 simple words in a ledger no one was ever meant to read. You should not be here. The voice came from directly behind her, and Grace nearly overturned the candle in her fright. She spun in her chair to find Julian standing in the library doorway, his expression carved from stone, his eyes moving from her face to the open ledger before her with a speed that told her he understood exactly what she had found. Your Grace? Grace managed, rising quickly. Though there was nowhere to hide, the book still open on the table behind her. I did not mean to intrude. I was only reading. You were reading estate records that have nothing to do with you, Julian said, crossing the room in swift strides, and closing the ledger with a sharp final motion. Records that are private to this family, and that a guest of this house has no right to examine without permission. No right? Grace felt something crack open inside her, grief and anger tangled together too tightly to separate. My uncle died on your family's land, Your Grace, and his death was recorded with less care than a household expense. I believe that gives me every right in the world. Julian went very still. Your uncle, Cedric Whitmore, Grace said, her voice shaking now with the effort of holding back tears she refused to let fall in front of him. My father's brother. I never knew he existed until tonight. I never knew any of this existed until my father's dying letter told me there was a truth buried in this house, a truth he could not prove before he died. I believed him foolish. I believed grief had confused him. I was wrong. You have no proof of anything, Julian said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. An old ledger entry proves nothing beyond the fact that men die in mines, Miss Whitmore, as they have done for centuries. It is a tragedy, but it is hardly a conspiracy. Then explain to me why the entry says no claim pursued, Grace shot back, as though someone made very certain that no claim ever would be. Explain to me why my father's share of that mine was forfeited, while your family's share was carefully protected. Explain to me why, 20 years later, his daughter was invited into this house only after his death, when there was no longer anyone left to ask the questions he might have asked himself. For a long moment Julian said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten in a way she did not entirely understand. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its cold edge entirely, replaced by something far more uncertain. I do not know the answers to those questions, he said quietly. I was a child when the mine closed. My father managed every detail of the estate himself, and shared little of it with anyone, myself included, until his death placed the title and its burdens on my shoulders, far sooner than either of us expected. Then let me help you find the answers, Grace said, surprising herself with the boldness of the offer. I did not come to this house seeking a fortune, Your Grace, whatever you may believe of me. I came because I had nowhere else to go. But I will not pretend I have not found a truth that concerns my own family, buried inside yours, and I will not simply look away from it because you find my questions inconvenient. Julian studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that Grace could not quite name, suspicion giving slow ground to something closer to reluctant respect. "You are either the most convincing liar I have ever encountered," he said finally, "or you are entirely sincere, and I confess I no longer know which possibility troubles me more." "Believe whichever you like," Grace said. "It changes nothing about what is written in that ledger." He was quiet again, staring down at the closed book between them as though it might offer answers neither of them possessed. When he looked up, his expression had settled into something Grace had not yet seen from him, a careful, guarded weighing of possibilities. "There is a strongbox in my father's old study," he said slowly, "containing documents even I have not fully examined, correspondence from the years surrounding the mine's closure. I avoided it after his death, telling myself there was no urgency in disturbing old grief. I begin to think I was wrong to leave it untouched." Grace's heart quickened. "Will you look through it?" "We will look through it," Julian said, and something in the way he said we settled between them like an unspoken agreement, fragile and entirely unexpected. "Tomorrow, when the household is occupied elsewhere, I would prefer this matter remain between us for now, Miss Whitmore, until we understand what we are truly dealing with." "And Edmund?" Grace asked carefully. "He asked me strange questions about my father, the very first week I arrived. Questions that felt less like curiosity and more like testing." Julian's expression darkened. "Edmund has always been more interested in the family fortune than the family name. If there is anything in those old papers that threatens his inheritance, I would rather he learn of it after we understand it ourselves, not before." Grace nodded, though a chill moved through her at the thought of Edmund's easy smile hiding something far sharper beneath it. She thought of his careless mention of the mine's history, so quickly withdrawn, and wondered how much he already knew, and how far he might go to protect whatever he stood to lose. "There is something else," Julian said, before she could ask further questions. "The conversation you overheard, weeks ago outside this very door. My steward, Mr. Colton, believes there are irregularities in the estate's recent accounts, sums that do not match what should remain given our income and expenses. I have suspected for some time that someone within this household has been diverting funds, slowly, carefully, in amounts small enough to escape easy notice." Grace's breath caught. "You believe it connects to the mine? To my father?" "I do not know," Julian admitted, and the honesty in his voice struck her more than any accusation could have. "But I have learned this much in the weeks since your arrival, Miss Whitmore. Every question leads to another question in this house, and I begin to suspect that whatever secret my father buried alongside that mine did not stay buried nearly as completely as he intended." He extinguished the candle himself before they parted for the night, leaving the library in darkness, and Grace made her way back to her small room with her mind racing faster than her feet. She had come to Ashford Manor believing herself unwanted, tolerated only out of obligation. She understood now that she had been feared instead, quietly and carefully, by someone who had worked for 20 years to make certain no one ever learned what happened to Cedric Whitmore in the northern shaft of a mine that no longer appeared on any modern map of the estate. Sleep did not come easily that night. Grace lay staring at the ceiling of her small room, turning over every fragment she had gathered, the ledger entries, Alice's careful whispers, Lady Beatrice's guarded slip of the tongue, Edmund's 2 quick questions, and now Julian's own uncertain admission that something dark moved beneath the surface of his family's wealth. Tomorrow, she thought, watching the candle shadows dance faintly across the wall, tomorrow she would finally begin to understand what her father had died trying to warn her about. And somewhere in the house below her, she suspected, someone else was lying awake as well, calculating exactly how much longer their secret could survive the arrival of a woman they had once dismissed as nothing more than a poor and inconvenient relation. Morning arrived sooner than Grace expected, though she had barely slept, and she dressed with trembling hands, uncertain whether her nerves came from fear or anticipation. She descended for breakfast to find Edmund already seated, watching her with an attentiveness that felt heavier than usual, as though he could sense some shift in the air of the house that he had not yet identified. "You look tired, Miss Whitmore," he observed, pouring her tea before she could reach for the pot herself, an unfamiliar courtesy that put her instantly on guard. "Did the house keep you from your rest?" "I slept poorly," Grace admitted, choosing the truth where a lie would have served her better, though she offered no further explanation. "How curious," Edmund said, his eyes flicking briefly toward the corridor that led to the study. "For I noticed a candle burning quite late in the library last night, long after the rest of the house had gone dark. I did wonder who among us had taken up reading at such an hour." Grace kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart lurched at the realization that Edmund had noticed far more than she wished him to. "The library is a comfort to me. I find I sleep better after losing myself in a book for an hour." "Of course," Edmund said, smiling in a way that did not quite reach his eyes. Though I confess, I did not take you for a woman who enjoyed old estate ledgers over novels. My cousin mentioned finding you at the reading table rather later than one might expect for pleasant fiction. So Julian had spoken to him after all, or Edmund had simply guessed, watching them both with the same sharp attention he applied to everything in this house. Grace set down her teacup with deliberate calm, refusing to let her hands betray the sudden unease tightening in her chest. Your cousin and I discussed nothing of consequence, she said evenly. I imagine he was simply surprised to find anyone awake at such an hour, given his own habit of solitary study. Edmund said, clearly unconvinced, though he let the matter drop with a shrug that felt far too casual to be genuine. Well, I shall leave you to your books and your secrets, Miss Whitmore, though I would advise caution, in this house particularly. Old papers have a way of surfacing consequences no one intended to invite. He rose and departed before she could form a reply, leaving Grace to finish her breakfast alone, with his warning circling uneasily in her thoughts. It was not the words themselves that troubled her most, but the certainty with which he had spoken them, as though he understood precisely what lay buried in those old estate records, and precisely how dangerous it might be for anyone who went looking. She found Julian in the corridor outside his father's old study shortly after midday, exactly as he had promised, his expression tight with the particular tension of a man about to confront something he had spent years avoiding. He said nothing as he unlocked the heavy door, leading her into a room thick with dust and the particular stillness of a space long undisturbed. The strong box sat exactly where he had described it, tucked beneath a shelf of leather-bound volumes, its brass lock tarnished with age. Julian retrieved a small key from a drawer in the desk and knelt before it, his hands hesitating a moment before he finally turned the lock and lifted the lid. Inside lay a modest collection of papers, yellowed with age, tied together with fraying ribbon. Julian lifted the first bundle carefully, untying it with the reverence of a man handling something he feared might crumble entirely at his touch. Grace knelt beside him, close enough to read over his shoulder, her breath held tight in her chest. The first letters were unremarkable, correspondence between the late Duke and various merchants, nothing that connected to the mine or to her family. But several letters deeper into the bundle, Grace's eye caught a familiar name, and she reached out instinctively to still Julian's hand before he could turn the page. Wait, she said softly. There, Cedric. Julian read the letter slowly, his jaw tightening with every line. It was written in the late Duke's own hand, addressed to a solicitor whose name meant nothing to either of them, discussing the settlement of a dispute following the mine's collapse. The language was careful, almost clinical, describing payments made to certain families in exchange for their silence regarding the conditions that had led to the accident. The shaft was known to be unstable, Julian read aloud, his voice growing quieter with each word. Repairs were delayed to preserve the quarter's profits. Following the incident, it was agreed that compensation would be offered only to those families unlikely to pursue further inquiry, with Whitmore's share redirected to cover the estate's own losses, given his brother's role in approving the delayed repairs. Grace's stomach turned cold. His brother's role. You mean my father approved the delay? Julian read further, his brow furrowed deeply now. It says here that Henry Whitmore, as the mine's overseer, recommended the repairs proceed immediately, and was overruled by my father, who insisted the delay was necessary to protect the quarter's earnings. When the shaft collapsed and Cedric was killed among the others, my father shifted the blame onto your father's original recommendation, twisting the truth to protect himself and the estate's reputation. Then my father did nothing wrong, Grace said, her voice trembling with a fury she had not expected to feel so suddenly. He was blamed for a decision he argued against, and his own brother died because your father valued profit over safety, and then buried the truth to protect his name. It appears so, Julian said quietly, and for the first time since her arrival, Grace heard something in his voice that sounded almost like shame. I am sorry, Miss Whitmore. I did not know any of this. I would not have spoken to you as I did on your first day, had I understood even a fraction of what my family did to yours. Grace said nothing for a long moment, staring at the letter in his hands, at the careful, damning script that had waited 20 years to be read by someone who finally understood its weight. The apology mattered less to her than the truth itself, though she found, unexpectedly, that it mattered more than she wished it to. There is more here, Julian said, lifting another folded paper from beneath the letters, his expression shifting from grief to something sharper, more urgent. A separate account, dated only a few years ago, listing payments made from the estate to an address I do not recognize. The handwriting is not my father's. It is far too recent for that. He held the paper toward the light, and Grace leaned closer, her breath catching as she read the signature scrawled at the bottom of the page. small and hurried, as though the author had wished to be finished with the matter as quickly as possible. It was Edmund's. Julian stared at the signature for a long moment, as though willing it to change into something less damning through sheer force of disbelief. Grace watched the color drain slowly from his face, replaced by a tightness around his mouth that told her more clearly than words how deeply this discovery had cut him. "This cannot be right," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Edmund has never had access to estate funds beyond his allowance. He would need my authorization for any payment of significance." "Unless he found another way," Grace said quietly, thinking of Mr. Colton's urgent voice through the study door weeks earlier. "The numbers do not match, not for the third quarter running. Your steward suspected irregularities in the accounts. Perhaps this is what he meant." Julian read the document again, more carefully this time, his eyes narrowing at details Grace could not yet interpret. "This lists payments to an address in the city, made quarterly, disguised within the estate's charitable donations. Someone has been routing money through false charity, and Edmund's signature authorizes each transfer." "Charitable donations no one questions closely," Grace said, understanding dawning slowly. "Because who would suspect a duke's family of stealing from their own goodwill?" Julian said nothing, but the grim set of his jaw answered clearly enough. He gathered the papers carefully, tucking them into a leather folio he retrieved from the desk, his movements sharp with barely restrained anger. "I must speak with Colton immediately," he said. "If Edmund has been diverting funds for years, there will be a pattern to it, records beyond what my father left behind. I need to understand the full scope before I confront him." "Should I come with you?" Grace asked, though she already suspected his answer. "No," Julian said, gentler than she expected. "Edmund believes you know nothing beyond old family gossip. Let him continue to believe that a little while longer. It may prove useful, having someone in this house he does not yet see as a threat." Grace nodded, though the idea of playing along with Edmund's easy charm, knowing now what he had likely done, filled her with a cold unease she could not entirely shake. She returned to her room to find Lady Beatrice's afternoon correspondence waiting for her, untouched, and forced herself to focus on ordinary tasks while her mind raced through everything she had learned. It was 2 days before Julian sought her out again, finding her alone in the garden where she had taken to walking in the late afternoons, the one place in the manor where she felt she could breathe freely without watchful eyes upon her. "Colton has confirmed it," Julian said without preamble, falling into step beside her along the gravel path. "Edmund has been diverting funds from the estate for nearly 6 years, small amounts at first, growing larger as he grew more confident no one would notice. The total sum is significant, enough to threaten the estate's stability if it continued unchecked much longer." "6 years," Grace repeated. "Since before my father died." Julian glanced at her sharply. "You believe the two are connected?" "I do not know," Grace admitted. "But Edmund asked me strange questions the very morning after my arrival, about whether my father had spoken of the Ashfords before his death. It felt less like idle curiosity and more like a man checking whether a secret remained buried. If he has spent years protecting whatever he has been doing with the estate's money, perhaps he feared my father's death might bring unwanted attention to this house, and unwanted attention to him. Or perhaps he feared you specifically," Julian said slowly, "knowing that your father's daughter, arriving here with nothing, might eventually uncover the very history I have spent the last few days learning myself." Grace considered this, the pieces settling into an uncomfortable new shape. If Edmund knew about the mine, about what truly happened to my uncle, and the blame placed unfairly on my father, then my arrival here was not simply inconvenient to him. It was dangerous. He had every reason to want me gone before I ever learned enough to matter. "And yet he has been perfectly pleasant to you," Julian said, something dark moving behind his eyes. "Watching you, testing you, waiting to see how much you knew, all while smiling as though he had nothing at all to hide." They walked in silence for a while, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, the weight of everything they now understood settling heavily between them. It was Grace who finally broke the quiet, voicing the question that had troubled her since first reading the ledger entry weeks earlier. "What happens now?" she asked. "To the money, to Edmund, to everything we have learned about the mine, and my father's part in it." Julian was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I intend to confront Edmund directly, once I have gathered sufficient proof to leave him no room for denial. As for the matter of the mine, and your father's unjust blame, I owe your family a debt I do not know how to properly repay. My father's decisions, and the lies that followed them, cost your uncle his life, and cost your father his good name in this county, whether or not the truth was ever widely known." "I do not want your guilt, Your Grace," Grace said, more sharply than she intended. "I want the truth acknowledged. And I want whatever wrong was done to my father corrected, if such a thing is even possible after so many years." "It is possible," Julian said, stopping to face her fully, his expression more open than she had seen it since her arrival. "There are legal matters to consider, records to be properly amended, and I intend to see them handled correctly, regardless of what it costs this family's reputation. You deserve that much, Miss Whitmore, and considerably more besides." Something in his tone made Grace's chest tighten unexpectedly, a warmth she had not anticipated feeling toward the man who had greeted her so coldly only weeks before. She pushed the feeling aside, unwilling to trust it, uncertain whether it belonged to genuine understanding, or simply to the exhaustion of carrying so many secrets alone for so long. "There is something else you should know," Julian continued, his voice dropping lower, though they stood alone in the garden with no one near enough to overhear. "Among the documents in my father's strongbox, I found reference to a legal claim your father held against this estate, tied directly to his forfeited share in the mine. It was never formally settled, only buried, the way so much else was buried alongside it. If pursued properly, through the correct legal channels, that claim could entitle you to a significant portion of this family's holdings." Grace stared at him, the ground seeming to shift slightly beneath her feet. "You are saying I have a legitimate claim to the Ashford fortune?" "I am saying your father did, and that such claims typically pass to surviving children," Julian said carefully. "I make no promises about how swiftly or easily such a matter could be resolved, particularly given how carefully it was hidden. But yes, Miss Whitmore, I believe you may have far more right to stand within these walls than either of us understood when you first arrived." The weight of her father's letter returned to her all at once, the words she had read so many times now taking on their full and staggering meaning. "You were never meant to grow up poor. Trust no one completely. When the time comes, do not be afraid to take what is rightfully yours." He knew, Grace whispered, more to herself than to Julian. He knew there was a claim, even if he could not prove it before he died. "That is why he sent me here, not simply because there was nowhere else for me to go, but because he wanted me to find this exact truth." "Then he was a wiser man than my own father in every way that mattered," Julian said quietly, "and I intend to see that his faith in you was not misplaced." They stood together in the fading afternoon light, the garden quiet around them, the enormity of everything they had uncovered settling slowly between them, like the first hint of a storm neither of them could yet fully see. Grace understood now that she stood at the edge of something far larger than she had imagined on the day she arrived, uninvited and unwanted, at the doors of Ashford Manor. But larger truths, she was quickly learning, rarely arrived without larger dangers attached to them. And somewhere inside the manor behind them, Edmund Ashford was almost certainly beginning to sense that the careful secrets he had protected for 6 long years were no longer nearly as safe as he had once believed them to be. That evening, supper proved a strained affair, though Grace suspected she was the only one at the table who understood exactly why. Edmund was in unusually high spirits, filling every silence with easy conversation about the county's upcoming autumn gathering, a ball hosted each year by a neighboring family of some standing, to which the Ashfords were always invited as a matter of long tradition. "You must attend, Miss Whitmore," Edmund said, refilling his wineglass with a casual flourish. "It would do you good to be seen among proper society, rather than shut away with Aunt Beatrice's letters every waking hour. Julian, surely you agree she ought to come." "If Miss Whitmore wishes to attend, she is welcome to," Julian said carefully, his eyes flicking briefly toward Grace across the table, a silent question passing between them that Edmund did not appear to notice. "Of course she wishes to attend," Edmund said, laughing lightly. "What young woman would not welcome an evening away from ledgers and correspondence? Though I confess, cousin, you have seemed rather occupied with ledgers yourself these past days. Colton mentioned you have spent a great deal of time reviewing the accounts." Grace's hand tightened around her fork, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, watching Julian from the corner of her eye. He answered smoothly, his voice betraying nothing of the tension she knew lay beneath it. "The autumn accounts require closer attention than usual this year," Julian said. "There have been some discrepancies I intend to resolve before the season's end." "Discrepancies," Edmund repeated, his tone light, though Grace caught the briefest hesitation before he lifted his glass again. "How dull that sounds. I do hope you find whatever error has crept into the numbers. Old Colton always was prone to small mistakes, bless him." "I am certain the matter will resolve itself clearly enough," Julian said, holding his cousin's gaze a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, "once I understand its full extent." Something passed across Edmund's face then, quick and difficult to name, gone before Grace could be certain she had seen it at all. He turned his attention back to his wine, steering the conversation once more toward the coming ball, but Grace noticed he ate very little of his supper after that, and excused himself earlier than usual once the meal concluded. Later that night, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep, Grace made her way quietly down to the kitchen for a cup of warm milk, a habit her father had taught her as a child whenever worry kept her awake. She had nearly reached the bottom of the servants' staircase when she heard voices drifting from the small parlor near the kitchen, low and urgent, unmistakably Edmund's among them. She paused in the shadowed stairwell, straining to listen. "Cannot simply wait and see what he finds," Edmund was saying, his easy charm entirely absent from his voice now, replaced by something sharper, almost frantic. "If Julian has begun looking closely at the accounts, he will find the pattern eventually, and once he does, there will be no explaining it away." A second voice answered, one Grace did not recognize, low and unfamiliar. "Then perhaps it is time to consider a different solution than waiting, sir. There are ways to ensure certain records simply disappear before anyone looks closely enough to understand them." "And the girl?" Edmund asked, and Grace's blood went cold at the mention of herself. "She has been asking questions since the day she arrived. Lady Beatrice has grown careless with her tongue around her, and Julian has taken a sudden and rather suspicious interest in old family history. If she has learned even half of what I fear she has, she becomes a problem far larger than a few missing sums in a ledger." "Problems can be managed, sir," the unfamiliar voice said, quiet and measured in a way that sent a fresh chill through Grace's chest, one way or another. Grace did not wait to hear more. She retreated up the stairs as quietly as her trembling legs would allow, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might betray her presence entirely. She reached her room and closed the door softly behind her, pressing her back against it, forcing herself to breathe slowly until the worst of her fear had passed. She understood now, with a clarity that frightened her more than anything she had learned about the mine or her uncle's death, that Edmund Ashford was not merely a man protecting his inheritance through careful theft. He was a man willing to consider far darker solutions to protect himself, and she had just become, by his own words, a problem he believed needed managing. She thought of Julian's warning from that very afternoon, that larger truths rarely arrived without larger dangers attached, and understood now precisely how right he had been. Whatever came next, she knew she could no longer simply watch and wait from the safety of the library shadows. The time for quiet observation had ended the moment Edmund began speaking of managing her presence in this house, and Grace understood, lying awake through the long hours until dawn, that she would need to move carefully, and quickly, if she meant to see the truth through to its end before Edmund found a way to bury it, along with everyone who threatened to expose it. Grace found Julian before breakfast the next morning, catching him alone in the corridor outside his study, before the rest of the household had stirred. She recounted the conversation she had overheard in a low, urgent voice, watching his expression harden with every word, until his jaw was set as tightly as she had ever seen it. "He spoke of managing you," Julian repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Those exact words?" "Those exact words," Grace confirmed, "and the man with him spoke of records disappearing, and of problems being handled one way or another. I do not know who he was, Your Grace, but he did not speak like a solicitor or a steward. He spoke like a man accustomed to darker business." Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides, though his voice remained controlled through sheer force of will. "I will not allow harm to come to you in this house, Miss Whitmore. Whatever Edmund believes himself capable of, he underestimates how closely I intend to watch him from this moment forward." "Watching him is not enough," Grace said. "If he believes I am a threat significant enough to warrant such conversations, he will not simply wait patiently for you to gather proof against him. We must move more quickly than he expects." Julian considered this, his eyes distant with calculation. "I have already sent word to the family's solicitor in the city, requesting a full and formal review of the estate's accounts, along with copies of the historical mining records we found in my father's strongbox. If Edmund suspects that review is already underway, he may grow desperate enough to make a mistake that exposes him fully. Or desperate enough to act before the review can conclude," Grace said, unable to keep the fear entirely from her voice. "Then we ensure he has no opportunity to act," Julian said firmly. "I will have Colton assign additional staff to the corridors near your room, under some ordinary pretense that will not alarm the household, and I would ask, Miss Whitmore, that you avoid being alone with Edmund under any circumstance, however innocent it may appear." Grace nodded, grateful for his protectiveness even as a small, treacherous part of her noted how naturally he had begun speaking of her safety, as though it mattered to him beyond the simple obligations of a host toward an unwanted guest. She pushed the thought aside, uncertain what to make of it, and focused instead on the danger still coiling tightly around them both. The solicitor arrived 4 days later, A precise, unassuming man named Edwin Marsh, who spent nearly a week closeted with Julian and Mr. Colton, poring over decades of estate records with meticulous care. Grace caught only glimpses of their progress, brief exchanges in the corridor where Julian's expression grew increasingly grim, though he offered her little detail beyond assurances that the picture was becoming clearer with each passing day. Edmund, for his part, grew steadily more agitated as the week progressed, his easy charm fraying at the edges whenever he believed no one was watching closely. Grace noticed him disappearing for long stretches in the afternoons, returning with the particular tension of a man who had spent the hours pacing rather than resting, and she caught him more than once glancing toward the study with an expression that mixed calculation with something closer to genuine fear. It was on the sixth evening, during a quiet supper that had grown increasingly tense despite everyone's careful attempts at ordinary conversation, that Edmund finally broke. "I understand you have brought Marsh from the city," he said abruptly, setting down his fork with more force than the moment required. "I confess I find it curious, Julian, that you would summon the family solicitor without mentioning the matter to me directly, given that whatever concerns the estate concerns my inheritance as well." "The accounts required a professional review," Julian said evenly, though Grace could see the careful control beneath his calm expression. "I saw no need to trouble you with the details until Marsh had completed his work." "How considerate," Edmund said, his voice sharpening with each word. "And what, precisely, has this professional review uncovered thus far, that you have felt so unnecessary to share with your own cousin?" Julian set down his own utensils, meeting Edmund's gaze directly across the table. "Perhaps this conversation is better suited to a private setting, Edmund, rather than the supper table." "I would rather have it now," Edmund said, his voice rising slightly, drawing a concerned glance from Lady Beatrice, who had gone very still at the head of the table. "I find myself increasingly uneasy, cousin, watching you huddle with solicitors and steal glances at Miss Whitmore, as though the two of you share some secret the rest of us are not permitted to know." "Edmund," Lady Beatrice said sharply, "that is quite enough." "Is it?" Edmund's composure was slipping now, the charming mask cracking to reveal something far more desperate beneath it. "Because I begin to suspect, Aunt Beatrice, that our dear cousin has decided to believe whatever fanciful story Miss Whitmore has spun for him, rather than considering that a woman with nothing to her name might have excellent reason to invent claims against this family's fortune." "I have invented nothing," Grace said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Everything I have learned, I found in this family's own records, kept by your own uncle, detailing exactly what happened in the northern mine, and exactly how my father's brother came to die there, while his blame was falsely shifted onto my father's shoulders." The room fell utterly silent. Lady Beatrice's face had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly against the tablecloth, and Grace understood in that moment that the old woman had known far more of the truth than she had ever admitted aloud. "The mine," Lady Beatrice whispered, more to herself than to anyone at the table. "I told you, child, that it was an old family matter, long settled. I did not think it necessary to relive such grief." "It was never settled, my lady," Grace said, more gently now, seeing the genuine sorrow beneath the old woman's carefully guarded composure. "Not truly. My father carried the unjust blame for that accident until the day he died, and my uncle's death was buried alongside a truth someone worked very hard to keep hidden." Edmund's hands had gone white where they gripped the edge of the table, his earlier bravado draining rapidly from his face. "This has nothing to do with the accounts," he said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier certainty. "Whatever ancient history you believe you have uncovered, Miss Whitmore, it does not explain your sudden and remarkable interest in this family's private financial affairs." "No," Julian said quietly, rising from his chair with a deliberate calm that seemed far more dangerous than any raised voice could have managed. "But it explains a great deal about why you might have wished her gone, before she learned enough to matter. Doesn't it, Edmund? Marsh has completed his review. Every discrepancy in this estate's accounts for the past 6 years traces directly back to authorizations bearing your signature, routed through false charitable donations to an address in the city that, I am reliably informed, houses nothing more than an empty office rented under a false name." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Grace could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Edmund's face had drained entirely of color, his eyes darting between Julian and the door as though calculating whether escape remained possible. "You cannot prove any of this came from malice," Edmund said finally, his voice thin and unconvincing even to his own ears, it seemed. "Perhaps I made errors in judgment, foolish investments I hoped to correct before anyone noticed. That is hardly the same as theft." "Perhaps," Julian said coldly, "you would care to explain, then, why I overheard nothing of errors in judgment, but rather heard from Miss Whitmore herself that you spoke, only days ago, of managing her presence in this house, and of ensuring certain records simply disappeared before anyone looked too closely. Edmund's composure shattered entirely at those words, his face contorting through a rapid succession of expressions before settling into something far uglier than the charming mask he had worn since Grace's arrival. He rose abruptly from his chair, knocking it backward with a sharp clatter against the floor. "You understand nothing," he snapped, his voice low and venomous now, all pretense of civility abandoned. "This estate should have been mine by right, had our grandfather's will been written with any sense at all. I have spent 6 years watching Julian inherit everything, simply because he happened to be born first, while I was left to beg for scraps of an allowance from a man barely older than myself. I took nothing that was not, in some fair accounting, already owed to me." "You took what belonged to families who lost husbands and sons in that mine," Julian said, his voice rising for the first time Grace had heard, sharp with genuine fury. "And when a woman arrived seeking nothing more than a place to grieve her father, you spoke of managing her, of making her disappear, as though her life meant nothing beside your comfort." "I never intended actual harm," Edmund said quickly, though his eyes betrayed the lie even as he spoke it. "I only meant to frighten her into silence, nothing more." "That is not what I heard," Grace said quietly, and the certainty in her voice seemed to finally break whatever remaining resolve Edmund possessed. He looked around the table once, at Julian's cold fury, at Lady Beatrice's stricken silence, at Grace's steady, unflinching gaze, and something in his expression collapsed entirely. Without another word, he turned and fled the dining room, his footsteps echoing rapidly down the corridor, before the front door slammed somewhere in the distance, leaving the remaining 3 sitting in stunned silence around a supper none of them would finish that night. "He will not get far," Julian said finally, breaking the silence with quiet, grim certainty. "Marsh has already prepared the necessary documentation. The local magistrate will be informed by morning, and every avenue of escape available to a man of his modest means will close quickly enough." Lady Beatrice pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears finally slipping free down her weathered cheeks. "I should have spoken sooner," she whispered. "I knew there was more to that old business than I ever admitted, even to myself. I was a coward, and my silence allowed this to fester far longer than it ever should have." "You are not the one who stole from this family, Aunt," Julian said gently, crossing to place a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Nor are you the one who buried a man's death beneath careless ink in a ledger no one was ever meant to read again." Grace sat quietly amid the wreckage of the evening, her mind still racing through everything that had unfolded in the span of a single supper. She had come to this house seeking nothing more than shelter, and had instead uncovered a truth large enough to shatter it entirely. Whatever came next, whatever the magistrate's investigation revealed, she understood now that there would be no returning to the quiet, uncertain existence she had lived before arriving at Ashford Manor. She caught Julian's eye across the ruined supper table, and found him watching her with an expression that held none of the suspicion from their first meeting, only something far warmer, and far more complicated than either of them yet had words to properly describe. Word arrived just past midnight that Edmund had been found at a coaching inn several miles from the manor, attempting to secure passage on the earliest carriage bound for the coast. 2 of Julian's own men had followed him quietly from the moment he fled the house, under instructions to keep their distance but never let him fully from their sight. When the local magistrate's constables arrived to take him into custody, Edmund offered no resistance beyond a string of bitter accusations aimed at everyone he believed had wronged him, from his late uncle's unfair will to Julian's cold indifference to his own carefully nursed grievances. Grace learned all of this the following morning from Mr. Colton, who delivered the news to Julian's study with the weary satisfaction of a man finally permitted to speak plainly after years of guarding uncomfortable suspicions in silence. "He will answer for the theft, certainly," Colton said, settling a thick folder of documents onto the desk before Julian. "Whether he answers for anything beyond that remains to be seen, Your Grace. Threats spoken in a private parlor are difficult to prove before a magistrate, whatever Miss Whitmore may have overheard with her own ears. Then we ensure the theft alone is sufficient to keep him from causing further harm," Julian said grimly. 6 years of diverted funds, Colton. That is not a small matter to be settled quietly with an apology and a reduced allowance." "No, Your Grace," Colton agreed. "Marsh believes the sum, once fully calculated, may exceed even our earlier estimates. There are accounts we have only begun to trace, small sums scattered across several false names, all leading back eventually to Mr. Edmund's own hand." Grace listened from her chair near the window, where Julian had invited her to remain during the discussion, a small but significant shift from the suspicion he had once directed her way. She thought of Edmund's easy smile on her very first morning at Ashford Manor, his careless questions about her father dressed up as simple curiosity, and felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet, aching relief that the danger he represented had finally been contained. "What becomes of Lady Beatrice now?" Grace asked. Once Colton had gathered his papers and departed. "She seemed truly shaken last night, Your Grace. I do not think she anticipated matters unfolding so completely." Julian's expression softened slightly. "My aunt has carried guilt over that mine for longer than either of us understood. I believe in some strange way, she may find peace now that the truth has finally surfaced, however painful its arrival. She was fond of your father, Miss Whitmore, more fond than she ever fully admitted. I suspect that fondness is part of why she found herself unable to speak plainly of what she knew." Grace considered this, thinking of Lady Beatrice's careful, guarded expressions whenever the subject of the past arose, the shuttered doorway of memory closing again and again before Grace could look inside. Perhaps it had never been simple coldness after all, but grief too heavy to carry into open conversation. "There is also the matter of your father's claim," Julian continued, his tone shifting into something more formal, more deliberate. "Marsh has reviewed the documents thoroughly, along with the original mining agreements. He believes the claim is legitimate and enforceable, should you choose to pursue it through proper legal channels." "And if I choose not to pursue it?" Grace asked quietly, though she already suspected she knew her own answer. "Then the choice remains entirely yours," Julian said. "I will not pressure you either way, Miss Whitmore, though I confess I would consider it a poor sort of justice if your father's name continued to carry an unfair blame, simply because pursuing the truth felt too uncomfortable for this family to bear." Grace studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the cold, suspicious man who had greeted her on the gravel drive weeks earlier, and found him almost entirely absent now, replaced by someone far more thoughtful, far more willing to sit with uncomfortable truths rather than dismiss them outright. "I will pursue it," she said finally. "Not for the fortune itself, though I will not pretend the money means nothing to a woman who arrived here with a single trunk and no prospects of her own. But my father deserves to have his name cleared, Your Grace, and my uncle deserves to be remembered as more than a careless notation in a ledger no one was ever meant to read again." "Then it will be done properly," Julian said, "and I will see to it myself, whatever the cost to this family's reputation in the county. You have shown more courage in these past weeks than most who have lived within these walls their entire lives, Miss Whitmore. I do not intend to stand in the way of the justice you have earned." Grace felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a tension she had carried since the moment she first read her father's unfinished letter, trembling in the candlelight of her narrow room. The truth was out now, dangerous and painful, but no longer buried. Whatever came next, whatever the legal process required of her in the weeks ahead, she understood that she had finally begun to answer the question her father's letter had posed so many weeks before. She had not simply survived her arrival at Ashford Manor. She had uncovered exactly what waited for her there, precisely as he had promised she would. The weeks that followed Edmund's arrest passed in a strange, suspended calm, the household adjusting slowly to the absence of the man who had once filled every silence with easy charm and careful watchfulness. Grace found herself settling into a rhythm at Ashford Manor unlike anything she had known during her first uncertain days there. No longer a poor relation tolerated out of obligation, but something closer to a woman with purpose, and increasingly, a woman with allies rather than watchful strangers surrounding her. Marsh returned twice more from the city, each visit bringing further clarity to the legal matter of her father's claim. The mining agreement, once properly examined alongside the correspondence found in the old Duke's strongbox, proved exactly as damning as Julian had first suspected. Henry Whitmore had never been responsible for the delayed repairs that led to the shaft's collapse. The blame, carefully constructed and quietly enforced through decades of silence, belonged entirely to the late Duke, whose insistence on protecting quarterly profits had cost Cedric Whitmore his life, and cost his surviving brother his good name. "The claim is not merely legitimate," Marsh explained one afternoon, spreading documents across Julian's desk with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to delivering complicated news plainly. "It is, in my professional judgment, considerably stronger than most claims of this nature I have encountered in 20 years of practice. Properly pursued, Miss Whitmore, you stand to receive a substantial portion of the estate's mining holdings, along with formal acknowledgement that your father's reputation was unjustly damaged by the previous Duke's actions." Grace absorbed this news quietly, seated beside Julian across the desk, aware of the strange symmetry of the moment, discussing her own fortune in the very study where she had once been accused of scheming to steal it. "What does formal acknowledgement mean precisely?" she asked. "A public statement, issued through proper legal channels, correcting the historical record," Marsh said. "Your father's name would be cleared entirely, and your uncle's death would be recorded honestly, as an accident resulting from the estate's own negligence rather than any failure on your father's part." Then I want that above all else, Grace said, without hesitation. The money matters. I will not deny it. But my father carried unjust blame to his grave, believing himself somehow responsible for his own brother's death. If nothing else comes from this, I want the world to know that was never true. Julian, who had remained largely silent through the exchange, spoke then with quiet certainty. Both shall be granted, Miss Whitmore. I have already begun drafting the public statement myself, and Marsh will ensure it carries the full weight of proper legal standing. The formal proceedings, once set in motion, moved with surprising swiftness given the county's usual pace of such matters. Word spread quickly through Ashford society that a legitimate claim had been discovered against the estate, and that the current Duke himself had insisted on honoring it fully. A fact that generated no small amount of gossip among the very families who had once whispered dismissively about the poor relation taken in at Ashford Manor. Lady Beatrice, for her part, grew steadily warmer toward Grace as the weeks progressed, her earlier guardedness dissolving into something closer to genuine affection, once the burden of her old silence had finally been lifted. She spoke more freely now of Henry Whitmore, sharing small memories Grace had never known, of a young man who had once possessed a quick laugh and a fierce loyalty to those he loved, qualities Lady Beatrice claimed she saw reflected clearly in his daughter. I should have spoken years ago, Lady Beatrice admitted one evening, as they sat together near the fire, in a scene that had grown comfortably familiar over the preceding weeks. I told myself silence was kindness, sparing everyone the pain of old grief. I understand now it was simply cowardice, dressed up in gentler language. You have more than made amends, my lady, Grace said gently, and I am grateful to have known you, whatever the circumstances of our meeting. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 2 months after Edmund's arrest, that the matter finally reached its formal conclusion. The county's leading families gathered at Ashford Manor at Julian's invitation, ostensibly for an ordinary autumn gathering, though word had spread widely enough that most in attendance understood some significant announcement awaited them. Julian stood before the assembled guests in the manor's great hall, Grace seated near the front beside Lady Beatrice, her heart pounding as he began to speak. Many of you have heard rumors these past weeks regarding matters within my own family, Julian said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. I intend today to address them plainly, rather than allow speculation to continue shaping a truth that deserves to be known accurately. He recounted the history of the Northern Mine with careful, deliberate honesty, sparing his own late father no measure of blame for the decisions that had led to Cedric Whitmore's death, nor for the deliberate falsehood that had shifted responsibility onto Henry Whitmore's shoulders for 2 decades of quiet suffering. Henry Whitmore was an honorable man, wrongly blamed for a tragedy that was never his fault, Julian said, his eyes finding Grace's across the crowded hall. His daughter, Miss Grace Whitmore, arrived at this house some months ago, believing herself an unwanted burden on my family's charity. I told her then, to my lasting regret, that she was never meant to be here. A murmur moved through the assembled guests at this admission, and Grace felt her cheeks flush under the sudden weight of so many curious eyes. I was wrong, Julian continued, his voice steady despite the personal nature of the confession. Miss Whitmore was not only meant to be here, she held every right to stand within these walls, long before I understood the truth of her family's connection to this estate. Her father's rightful claim to a share of this family's mining fortune, buried for 20 years through my own father's deception, has now been formally acknowledged and honored in full, through proper legal proceedings overseen by our family's solicitor. He gestured toward Marsh, who stood near the hall's entrance with a leather folio containing the formal documentation, ready to answer any questions the gathered families might have regarding the legitimacy of the proceedings. I say this today, before all of you, so there can be no doubt or misunderstanding, Julian said. Miss Whitmore's claim was pursued and honored, not out of charity, nor out of any obligation beyond simple justice long overdue. Her father's name is cleared, her uncle's death is recorded honestly, at last, as the negligence of this estate rather than any failure of the Whitmore family, and her rightful inheritance stands secured, entirely her own, to do with as she sees fit. The hall fell into a heavy, considering silence, broken finally by Lady Beatrice, who rose from her seat beside Grace with surprising steadiness for a woman of her years. I will add only this, Lady Beatrice said, her voice carrying clearly despite its age. Grace Whitmore has shown more courage and integrity in the short months I have known her than most who have carried the Ashford name their entire lives. Whatever fortune she now claims, she has earned 100 times over, through patience and honesty this family did not always deserve from her in return. Grace rose slowly to her feet as every eye in the hall turned toward her, her heart pounding with an emotion she could not entirely name. grief and vindication, and something else entirely tangled together after months of uncertainty finally reaching their resolution. "I did not come to this house seeking a fortune," she said, her voice steadier than she expected once she found the courage to speak. "I came seeking shelter, having lost everything else. What I found instead was a truth my father died trying to protect me with, and a family willing, in the end, to honor that truth even at considerable cost to their own name and comfort. I am grateful for that honesty, more than any sum of money could ever properly repay." The gathering slowly dispersed into quiet conversation once the formal announcement concluded, though Grace noticed considerably warmer glances directed her way now than the careful, dismissive assessments she had received on her first difficult weeks at Ashford Manor. She found Julian near the hall's edge once the crowd had thinned, his expression holding a warmth entirely absent from their first cold meeting on the gravel drive so many months before. "You did not need to speak so plainly of your own father's failings," Grace said quietly, as they stepped together onto the terrace overlooking the darkening gardens. "You could have simply honored the claim quietly, without staining your own family's reputation before the entire county." "I have grown tired of this family's silence," Julian said simply. "It cost your family dearly, Miss Whitmore, and it very nearly cost you your safety as well, given how far Edmund proved willing to go to protect his own secrets. I would rather stand honestly before the county's judgment than continue the pattern of quiet deception that has caused so much harm already." Grace studied him in the fading evening light, remembering the cold suspicion of their first meeting, the careful distance he had maintained through their earliest weeks together, and the gradual, unmistakable warmth that had grown steadily between them since the night they had first opened his father's strongbox together, in search of a truth neither of them yet understood. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now that the claim is settled, and Edmund is answering for his crimes, and the truth is finally known to everyone who once whispered about my arrival here?" "That depends entirely on what you wish for yourself," Julian said carefully. "You are, as of this morning's proceedings, a woman of considerable independent means, Miss Whitmore. You owe this family, and this house, nothing further." Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade over the gardens where she had once walked in quiet fear of Edmund's careful watchfulness. She thought of her father's letter, still folded carefully in her trunk, of his final instruction written in an unsteady hand. "Do not be afraid to take what is rightfully yours. I have decided to leave Ashford Manor," she said finally. Julian went very still beside her. "Leave," he repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. "May I ask why, after everything that has been settled here?" "Because everything I came here to find, I have found," Grace said, choosing her words with care. "My father's name is cleared. My uncle's death is honestly recorded. My inheritance is secured, entirely my own, exactly as it should have been these past 20 years. I did not come to this house to become part of it, Your Grace. I came because I had nowhere else to go, and I found instead a truth that no longer requires these walls to hold it. I would like to build something of my own now, somewhere that does not carry the weight of everything that happened here." "I understand," Julian said quietly, though something in his voice betrayed how little he wished to. "When do you intend to go?" "Within the week," Grace said. "Marsh has already arranged the transfer of funds, and I have found a small property near the coast, modest but entirely mine, purchased with money that belongs to me by right rather than by charity. I would like to begin my life there, away from ledgers and old griefs and the careful watchfulness this house has taught me far too well." She departed 6 days later, her single worn trunk replaced by proper luggage befitting a woman of independent means, though she kept her father's letter tucked close beside her the entire journey, exactly as she had carried it the day she arrived. Lady Beatrice embraced her at the manor steps with tears she no longer bothered to hide, extracting a promise of regular correspondence that Grace intended to honor faithfully. Julian said little as her carriage was loaded, and standing at a careful distance that reminded Grace, briefly, of the cold stranger who had greeted her arrival so many months before. But as the footman closed the carriage door, he stepped forward once more, his composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "I do not wish you to go believing this house holds nothing worth returning to," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it clearly. "I do not believe that, Your Grace," Grace said gently. "I believe I needed to leave at once, on my own terms, taking only what was rightfully mine, before I could ever consider what might be worth returning for." The first weeks at her new property passed in a strange, quiet wonder Grace had never expected to feel. The house was modest compared to Ashford Manor, small enough that she learned every corridor and window within her first few days, but it belonged entirely to her, purchased with money that was rightfully hers rather than granted through anyone's pity or obligation. She hired a housekeeper, an older woman named Margaret who asked no questions about her past and offered none of her own in return. and together they slowly brought the neglected garden back to life, planting rows of herbs and late autumn flowers along the stone walls. Grace wrote to Lady Beatrice faithfully, as promised, sharing small details of her new life, the progress of her garden, the fishing boats she watched from her window each morning, the quiet satisfaction of choosing her own days without answering to anyone's suspicion or charity. Lady Beatrice wrote back with equal faithfulness, her letters growing warmer and more open with each passing week, filled with news of the estate's slow recovery from Edmund's betrayal and occasional, careful mentions of her nephew, offered without comment, but never entirely without purpose. She did not see him again for nearly 2 months, settled into her small coastal property with a garden of her own, and a modest independence she had never once imagined possible during her years of quiet poverty. It was on a gray afternoon, much like the one that had first brought her to Ashford Manor, that a carriage arrived unannounced at her gate, and Julian stepped down from it with none of the cold composure she remembered from their first meeting, only a quiet, uncertain hope that softened every hard line she had once associated with him. "I have come without invitation," he said, "which I understand is rather poor manners, given how carefully you chose to leave on your own terms." "You have," Grace agreed, though she found she did not mind it nearly as much as she expected to. "I do not come to ask you to return to Ashford Manor," Julian said. "I understand now that whatever you build, you deserve to build entirely on your own terms, exactly as your father intended when he sent you there in the first place. I come only to ask whether there might be room, in whatever life you are building here, for a man who spoke very poorly to you on the day you arrived, and who has spent every day since regretting it." Grace studied him for a long moment, the autumn wind moving softly through the garden she had planted herself, in soil that belonged entirely to her, purchased with a fortune that was rightfully hers rather than a gift from anyone's charity. "I left your house taking everything that was owed to me," she said finally, "and I do not regret a single part of that choice. But I find, standing here now, that some things are not taken from a ledger or a claim, Your Grace. Some things must be offered freely, and accepted just as freely in return, if they are to mean anything at all." "Then I offer it freely," Julian said, "whatever small thing it may be worth, after everything my family cost yours." Grace considered the man before her, no longer the cold stranger of her arrival, no longer even entirely the careful, guarded Duke who had helped her uncover her father's truth. She considered her own fortune, secured and entirely her own, and the quiet, independent life she had built with it, needing no one's permission and no one's charity ever again. "Then perhaps," she said, allowing herself a small, genuine smile as she stepped forward at last, "we might begin again, on far more equal terms than either of us managed the first time." The magistrate's proceedings against Edmund Ashford stretched into the following spring, longer than anyone at Ashford Manor had originally anticipated, as Marsh and the local authorities untangled the full extent of 6 years of carefully hidden theft. Grace followed the developments through Lady Beatrice's letters, each one arriving with fresh details that painted an increasingly complete portrait of a man who had spent years nursing resentment into something far darker than simple greed. The false charitable donations, once fully traced, revealed a network of small deceptions spanning nearly a dozen fictitious accounts, money quietly funneled away not merely to fund an idle lifestyle, but increasingly toward gambling debts accumulated in the city. Debts that had grown desperate enough in recent months to explain the escalating danger Edmund had represented. The man Grace had overheard speaking with him near the kitchen parlor, it emerged during testimony, was no household servant at all, but a debt collector Edmund had grown entangled with through increasingly reckless wagers, a man willing to suggest darker solutions than either of them had initially intended to pursue. Edmund was ultimately sentenced to transportation, his once considerable charm doing little to sway a magistrate who had reviewed the full weight of evidence against him. Lady Beatrice wrote of the sentencing with a heavy heart, grieving not for what Edmund had become, but for the boy she remembered from decades earlier, before resentment and easy privilege had curdled into something she no longer recognized. "I do not believe he was born cruel," she wrote to Grace that spring. "I believe circumstance and unchecked bitterness made him so. Slowly. Over years, none of us thought to watch closely enough. It is a hard lesson, learning how easily a person can be lost to grievances left too long untended." Grace considered this often, walking the shoreline near her small coastal home in the months that followed, turning over the strange, tangled fortune that had brought her from grinding poverty to independent comfort within the span of a single difficult year. She thought of her father often during these walks, wishing more than anything that he had lived long enough to see his name properly cleared, to know that his brother's death had finally been recorded with the honesty it always deserved. It was during one such walk, nearly 4 months after Julian's unexpected visit to her gate, that Grace found herself considering a question she had avoided fully answering since that gray afternoon when he had stood before her offering something far more uncertain than fortune or inheritance. She had not refused him outright, nor had she fully accepted the tentative beginning he proposed. Instead, they had settled into a careful, patient correspondence over the following months, letters traveling between the coast and Ashford Manor with increasing regularity, each one revealing small new facets of a man she was only beginning to properly understand, beyond the cold suspicion of their first meeting. Julian wrote of estate matters at first, careful and formal, gradually loosening into observations about the changing seasons across the northern parcels, about Lady Beatrice's slow recovery from the winter's harsh weather, about small kindnesses Colton had shown the household staff that Julian confessed he had never properly noticed before Grace's arrival taught him to look more closely at the people around him. Grace found herself writing back with equal honesty, sharing details of her garden's slow transformation, of Margaret's dry, practical wisdom, of the strange peace she had found in choosing her own days without answering to anyone's expectations. She wrote, too, of harder things, of grief that still surfaced unexpectedly when she thought of her father, of anger toward Edmund that had not entirely faded despite his sentencing, of the complicated gratitude she felt toward a family that had ultimately righted a wrong they had spent 20 years burying. It was in one such letter, written on a mild spring evening with her window open to the sound of distant waves, that Grace finally allowed herself to fully answer the question Julian had posed at her garden gate months earlier. "I have spent these past months building something entirely my own," she wrote, "and I do not regret a single day of it. But I find, increasingly, that independence and solitude are not quite the same thing, and that the life I have built here feels less like an ending and more like a foundation, one I would not mind sharing, carefully and on equal terms, with someone willing to build alongside me, rather than simply invite me back into something already built." Julian arrived at her gate again less than a fortnight later, this time with considerably less uncertainty in his bearing, though no less careful respect for the independence she had fought so hard to secure. They walked together along the shoreline that afternoon, Grace pointing out the small details of a life she had built entirely through her own effort and her father's long overdue justice, Julian listening with the same careful attention he had once reserved for suspicious ledgers, now turned instead toward understanding the woman who had transformed his entire family's history within the span of a single difficult year. "I do not intend to ask you to abandon any of this," he said, gesturing toward the modest, well-tended house and garden behind them. "Whatever comes next between us, I understand now that it must be built alongside what you have already created here, not in place of it." "Then, perhaps," Grace said, watching the late afternoon light catch gently across the water, "we might begin exactly there, and see what grows from ground that finally belongs entirely to no one's charity but our own choosing." They were married the following autumn in a quiet ceremony held not at Ashford Manor's grand chapel, but in the small coastal village Grace had come to consider her true home, attended by Lady Beatrice, by Margaret, by Marsh and Colton, and by a scattering of villagers who had grown fond of the quiet, independent woman who had settled among them the previous spring. Grace kept her coastal property even after the wedding, dividing her time between the manor's grand halls and the modest garden she had built entirely with her own hands, refusing to let either home entirely replace the other. Lady Beatrice, in her final years, often remarked that Ashford Manor had never felt more genuinely like a home than it did once Grace Whitmore had claimed her rightful place within it, not as charity, and not even entirely as inheritance, but as something earned through patience, courage, and an unwillingness to accept a lie, simply because it had been buried carefully enough to seem forgotten. Grace herself, walking the gardens of Ashford Manor in the years that followed, often thought of her father's unfinished letter, still kept carefully in a small box beside her bed, its final words as true now as they had been the night she first read them by candlelight in a narrow, unfamiliar room. "Trust no one completely," he had written, "not even those who seem kind. Watch, listen, and when the time comes, do not be afraid to take what is rightfully yours." She had done exactly that, in the end, taking not only the fortune that had been unjustly withheld from her family for 20 long years, but something her father could never have fully anticipated when he wrote those final words, a life built entirely on her own terms, a truth finally spoken aloud, after decades of careful silence, and a partnership with a man who had learned, through her patient courage, to value honesty far more than the comfortable lies his family had once relied upon to protect its name. The Duke, who had once told her she was never meant to be there, spent the remainder of his days telling anyone who would listen that Grace Whitmore had been the finest thing to ever arrive, uninvited and unwanted, at the doors of Ashford Manor, and that he considered himself endlessly fortunate that she had chosen, in the end, to stay exactly as long as she wished, and not one day longer than her own free will allowed. In the years that followed, Grace made a quiet practice of returning each spring to the small coastal village where her independence had first taken root, walking the same shoreline where Julian had once arrived uninvited to ask for a second chance he had not yet earned. She brought their children with her in time, teaching them to tend the same modest garden Margaret had helped her cultivate during those uncertain early months, insisting they understand that a fortune meant little without the courage and honesty required to hold it rightly. She told them, when they were old enough to understand, the full story of their grandfather Henry Whitmore, of the uncle they had never known, of the mine that had swallowed one brother's life and nearly swallowed the other's good name alongside it. She kept nothing hidden from them, believing firmly that the silence which had once caused so much harm within the Ashford family should never again be permitted to take root in her own. Lady Beatrice remained a fixture in their lives until her final years, growing steadily warmer and more openly affectionate as the seasons passed. Delighting in the grandchildren she claimed had inherited her own late brother's sharp wit, alongside their mother's quiet, unshakable resolve. She often told visitors with the particular pride of someone who had witnessed an entire family's redemption firsthand, that Ashford Manor had spent generations mistaking silence for dignity, and that it had taken a poor relation with nothing but a single trunk and her father's unfinished letter to teach them the difference between the two. Colton remained steward of the estate for many years afterward, overseeing the accounts with a renewed diligence that left no room for the kind of quiet deception Edmund had once managed to hide for so long. He often remarked, in his later years, that he had never again allowed himself to overlook a discrepancy, however small, remembering too clearly how nearly 6 years of careful theft had gone unnoticed before a determined young woman's arrival forced the entire household to finally look closely enough to see the truth. As for Grace herself, she never forgot the cold words that had greeted her on her very first afternoon at Ashford Manor. "You were never meant to be here," though she came, in time, to understand them not as an insult, but as the beginning of a truth that needed uncovering, one that had waited 20 patient years for someone brave enough to finally bring it into the light.